Hello, Internet, and welcome to the OWASP DevSlop Show. Hey, hacker jungle gym built on DevSecOps disasters. I'm Amy, and I'm here with my co-host, Nikki, and we're here to talk to Abhay about creating a killer security program with, guess what, security unit tests. If you're seeing value while you're watching this video, please hit the subscribe button and make sure you're giving it a thumbs up so that you don't miss any of our future shows. Links to everything we'll cover today will also be in the description box below. And before we jump into it, here's a short message from our sponsor, Shift Left.
This episode is sponsored by Shift Left. Shift Left Core is a SAS-based static analysis tool that helps teams find and fix vulnerable code early in a sprint. It performs graph analysis that is inherently accurate and never takes source code off your server. By combining SAST and software composition analysis in rapid scans, it can be integrated with CI/CD tools for continuous testing. 46% of applications managed by Shift Left are scanned at least weekly, 14 times the rate of legacy tools. Shift Left is fast and safe, so scan early, scan often. Get started for free at shiftleft.io.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. I am Nikki, and in today's show, we're chatting with Abhay Bhargav from We45 and AppSecEngineer about DevSecOps and security unit testing. Abhay started his career as a breaker of apps in pen testing and red teaming, but these days he works on scaling AppSec with cloud-native security and DevSecOps. Abhay is also a speaker and trainer at most major security conferences worldwide. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, Abhay.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
It's
thanks
the
for
first
being
time.
here.
Thank you.
I-
Yeah, I've been watching. I've been a big fan of the show for a while now. So thanks for having me. This is the first time I've been on the show.
Cool. We're so happy you're here. So what's on the agenda today?
So one of the things that I'm going to be looking at is the concept of security unit tests. Right now, this has been an area of continuing focus for me because I do a lot of work in DevSecOps and. With DevSecOps, a lot of us think of pipelines and CI/CD and stuff like that, but we don't think small enough, is what I feel. So today it's going to be all about how small things can give you a lot of big value. So that's basically what I'm going to be talking about today, which is security unit tests.
Cool.
Right. Yeah, so today my area of focus is going to be security unit tests, like I mentioned. And I just prepared some slides to talk about some of the key building blocks. And then, of course, we'll be looking at a bunch of demos. And I think we'll keep this an interactive session with the different types of tests that I'm going to be talking about. And I have some demos and labs prepared for this part of the show as well. So first of all, if you look at DevSecOps, it's not all automation, because a lot of us think of DevSecOps in terms of pure automation. But DevSecOps is largely about culture and people alignment. I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of us forget. It's a lot of us immediately, our mind goes to automation, but it's actually more about the people. It's more about getting culture aligned. Of course, automation is in there. It's a very important part of it because you want to be able to automate the mundane, the standard stuff that you don't have to spend every day doing manually and intervening with manually. So that's obviously one of the big things. And of course, you want to measure it, manage it, continuously improve. Right? There's no point in doing things that it's not improving something for you. So this is my kind of a diagram that I talk about whenever I do a DevSecOps session or a DevSecOps class. So basically, the idea here is whether you want to call it shift left or whether you want to call it embedded security or whatever. I see this as a step where you are essentially having some kind of security feedback loop at every stage of the DevSecOps cycle, right? So I always like to start off with threat modeling. I'm a big believer of threat modeling because threat modeling, in my opinion, really solves a lot of the problems that you would face downstream. So I start with the threat modeling. And if you see, in fact, even later on when I talk about unit tests, you'll see that threat modeling plays a pretty big role in the way we do unit tests as well. So start off with threat modeling. You go into, once you start building the code, writing out the code, that's when you start doing mostly pre-commit, commit time security activities like SAST and source composition analysis and so on. Then, of course, you can, once you deploy it or when you're about to deploy it, that's when you start looking at DAST, IAST, or security regressions and so on. And then, of course, post deployment or just before deploying it to a prod like environment, that's when you can start looking at your infrastructure security, hardening, and post that you have more. All of these are, in my opinion, DevSecOps activities because you are embedding them and you are making sure that you have these feedback loops. So for us, the desired DevSecOps traits essentially is multiple test and verification activities because you want to test multiple times, right? Find early, find often, right? That's basically what the shift left mantra is all about. And that's basically what we want to do. We want to identify issues fast and fix them fast. So multiple test and verification activities embedded across the SDL. We want high fidelity feedback loops. Now, this is a very important point, especially with the kind of, this also plays into two things. It plays into automation. It also plays into culture and alignment activities because you can still have all of this. You can have these security pipelines. You can do all of these security activities. But if you don't have high fidelity, if you don't have if you don't have high degree of true positives, that's where your people are not going to trust your security process, right? If you have too many false positives or if you have false negatives, mostly it's the false positives problem that people have a problem. That's why a lot of people hate AppSec folks, because of the whole false positive problem. So high fidelity is a very important thing to stress on. And that's basically one of the things that I want to talk about as well. And of course, all of this leading to better proactive security controls. That's all of this is leading to better security controls and improvement. This is, again, you can evolve to a better maturity cycle. You can evolve to a better security program through a measurement of this, management of this in a big way. In fact,
Quick
yeah,
question. Yeah. So when you're evaluating this, as a practitioner, how do you incorporate the maturity of an organization into how you assess how to insert these DevSecOps kind of pillars, so to speak?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, what I kind of do, and my team when we work on DevSecOps projects is we start to look at the way they're set up itself, right? And that becomes a pretty big starting point for the whole thing, right? For the maturity to come out, because there are different teams, and some of them are set up more centrally. Some of them have more, security as silos, set up as part of the way they're organized, and that tells me that they need a lot of work to get to about DevSecOps or something that a little bit more what I'm talking about, right? It's typically what I see is that teams that are that work with security champions or security embedded as part of the engineering teams, and where engineering teams take security as part of their key responsibilities, that's where I think the maturity becomes a little faster. Implementing activities becomes a little easier. So that's my take on the whole thing. Of course, it's not always a perfect this leads to that kind of a situation, but that's typically what I have seen, and that gives you an idea of a little bit of maturity. I don't really see the other things so much, right? The automation stuff you will figure out if the foundations are good. So if your team organization is good, if the way you are responsibly managing security as part of the engineering process is there, then there's a good chance that you will find your way to maturing faster and faster, or at the speed and scale you want. But it's when the whole team and the structure is set up, which with way too much centralization and silos, that's when I would find the maturity to kind of drop off a little bit. It takes a little bit more time. It's not impossible. It takes a little more time.
Cool. Thanks.
No worries. Yeah. So just dialing back to the unit test piece. Now, I saw this. In fact, I spoke at the OWASP Developer Summit that happened a couple of months ago. And I saw this very interesting presentation by Andreas Falk, who talked about security test pyramid. And I really liked that concept. And I thought it would be a great incorporation. Think about this because I had already done a bunch of these activities and just not framed it this way. So this is a shout out to Andreas Falk, who actually came up with this concept. I'm not sure whether he came up with it, but that's where I heard it the first time. So he talks about the fact that there is this there is a test pyramid, which is something that we see with testing, right? Your functional tests and so on, where you have tests that are low effort and fast feedback, and high effort and slow feedback, right? So you have different types of tests. Not all tests are the same, right? And that's the same with security testing as well. You probably have seen this, right? With security tests, you look at a pen test to be, it's a lot of effort, but it's slow feedback. So that's probably at the top of that particular pyramid. So the idea here is to have different types of tests that you are aligning as part of this whole thing, right? The idea is to do different types of tests, because once you do different types of tests, you are also able to achieve different kinds of outcome at different parts of your development cycle. So for instance, for me, I would look at, and a lot of people think of unit tests as okay, this is addressing only one single function or something like that. For me, unit tests, especially from a security context, would be something that is small, something that is low effort but fast feedback. That's what I would categorize as a unit test. So you have a lot of possibilities of doing that today, right? You have modern SAS tools that help you achieve that. You have you can incorporate that as part of your proactive security controls. I'll be looking at some of these as we go along as well. But as you go up the chain, you'll see that some of the larger tests require more time, more high effort. So why not line your security program with more of these low effort, fast feedback, because you're able to find and fix bugs as early as possible. So
One
my
moment.
point is,
Um,
yeah, sure.
just we got something in the chat because I think most people agree on what a unit test is, but they wanted to know what you mean by workflow and service tests, since those definitions tend to differ among people. So if you could clarify.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, most of these tests, if you look at the workflow and service tests, right, you'll typically see that they are like end-to-end tests, right? You're testing either a service or you're testing how a service interacts with other services, right? So these are typically what you call end-to-end tests. I log into this application, then I go over to the travel booking section, then I select flights, and then I do this. So that is like an end-to-end service/workflow test. So it could be one service. I could be testing a service interaction with another service. This is typically slower, right? That's what you do. If you're in the QA side of the fence, you'll probably be seeing this called an E2E or an end-to-end test, where they write this test automation script that would invoke a functionality or a set of functionalities like a user would. So a user logs in, then user does this, user book flights, and user does this. They finish that, and then that is the end of that workflow, or that is the end of that particular module. So that is what I refer to as a workflow or a service test. So in some cases it's smaller, some cases larger, some cases it's a little bit more integrated, and in the case of microservices style architectures, it's more service to service, which could frame your workflows as well, right? So that's also an example of that. So that's something that's a little bit more involved. You have to have your DAST or your IAST suite hook up to your end-to-end test automation that will take you through and then help you find vulnerabilities. It's definitely a little bit slower than just running shorter scans, or let's say a specific type of test that would test a very specific thing, like is this password meeting 8 characters, or is this logout achieved, or is this JART based on a particular type of strength, cryptographic strength. So those are very specific. I would call them smaller unit tests, but these are a little bit more end to end. Does that? I'm hoping that answers that question.
Yeah, you got to thank you in the chat. So
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So the thing that I kind of took from this was that a lot of these, if we can do a better job of the small things, right, the unit test angle of the whole thing, which is, can we line up this, top load our testing efforts a little bit more, where we have these kind of unit tests, uh, smaller tests. Again, I use the unit. I'm going to use the word unit tests and smaller tests in a in a similar vein, because I see them as that, especially from a security perspective. So for me, the whole unit test thing kind of gave me a bunch of ideas as to what we can do, right? And today, thankfully, a lot of these frameworks today support this. In fact, uh, I started in DevSecOps in about 2015, 2016, one of the earliest, and DevSecOps was not even a thing back then, not much of a thing back then. And then there was really no talk about how we can take this to security. So I was trying to experiment with a lot of these different things. And so I, based on that, and based on the kind of the small nature of the tests, I thought of these. I kind of categorized them into these categories, right? So today, the good thing is, let's start with the bottom. SAST, although we don't see SAST as unit tests, today you can express a lot of SAST related queries or SAST related checks as unit tests, especially with tools like CodeQL or SemGrep and stuff like that. You can write very small scope tests that would find this one thing, and you could run it against this one thing, right? It doesn't have to be this massive. All of us, when you think of SAST, we think of this massive tool that's scanning the entire code base, but that's not necessarily the case, especially today, because you do have tools that can support you writing out very specific tests, or you leveraging very specific tests, even if you don't write them out yourself, leveraging very specific tests to find very specific things. And that's something that I would categorize as unit, simply because it's small scope, it's very fast, and it gives you feedback immediately, right? Again, the other type of tests that I'll also be talking about a little bit is the functionality driven tests, right? So this is where threat modeling kind of becomes a very important piece, because um, one of the things that I have started to do, and I'm a big proponent of, is a story driven threat modeling thing, where you essentially take up a user story and then you identify threats against only that story. So let's say in this sprint of your SDL, you're taking up 3 user stories, you only identify security issues or threats for those user stories, and that gets broken into security test cases. And those security test cases can be made into unit tests, right? So that's something that is also possible. And that is something that I've seen with a lot of my clients, as well as people doing as well. That's become really powerful in supercharging the way they get automation, or they get gains out of their automation process. The other thing that I'm also seeing, especially with the cloud coming into play, is with the cloud config, you also have tools that can help you do the similar kind of thing that SAST, a small scope SAST, can help you do. But the one of the things that I'm super excited about, and I have a demo as well, which is around policy Escort, and how you can use these policy Escort test suites to be able to actually uh, test your security policy, your authorization policy. You can do all of that stuff in much better, in a much better, more repeatable way than just than before, than it was possible before. This is something that I'll also be talking about a little bit as well.
It looks like with these 4, I really like the way you break these up. But with those 4, like, you can do them at any point. There's not necessarily, they don't necessarily build on each other, but all of them give you a better visibility of the security program. Would you agree with that? Like, you could start with, if you go back to the slides for a second, I just can't see them.
Oh, you can?
Oh, now I can. Yeah. But if you go back to the like environmental security unit test, you could just start there, right? And then you could then decide 2 weeks from now to start writing SAS-based unit tests. It's not like they're hierarchical in any way, which is kind of cool.
They're not linked to each other as well. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very good point you brought up. They're not barriers of entry in any way. They don't have too many dependencies by themselves, right? They're independent units. And as independent units, they're able to give you that start. So let's say you don't have much of a SAST practice. You can still do something else which is still get you started, and something is still better than nothing in many ways. So absolutely, you're absolutely right there.
No, it's a really great way of breaking these down. I really like it. Cool.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Uh, yeah, so this is basically what I had in mind, and I do have demos to kind of back me up through this process. But what I want to do is just talk a little bit about these things. There are some, obviously, there are some tools that I'm going to be talking about. Most of them that I'm going to be talking about are open source. So that's a good thing. I'm not going to be covering anything that is that's out of reach of the people, or people who are following along, or people who want to learn this. So this is something that we'll be talking about as we go along.
One more point of
Uh,
clarification, pardon me.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
so, folks in the chat want to know a little bit more about what policy as code is. Can you elaborate? And also, this is the famous question. Everybody wants to know, are we going to get the slides after this?
Yeah. Absolutely. Let me answer the second question first. You'll definitely get the slides. That's not a problem. Regarding policy as code, I'll get to it a little bit later, but let me give you the the very quick version right now. I'm going to talk about it in a great deal of depth, but let me just quickly run through it for everybody who's asked the question. So, policy as code essentially is the ability to represent any kind of a security policy, or an authorization policy, or an access control policy as code, in the sense that, look, if you want to do input validation, let's say you have an input validation policy. So that can be, instead of you hard coding it into your source code, you essentially have this other layer, which you have, it's written as a very expressive syntax, right? And once a request comes in, it queries this layer and checks, hey, is this as per policy? Is this user supposed to access this object and supposed to do this action? Tell me if that is in your policy. And if the policy object just comes back very simple with a yes or no answer, right? And it comes back with a no answer, obviously it's not allowed, but if it comes back with a yes, then that user is allowed to do that particular thing. So instead of you having to write these policy statements and then hard code them into your source code, you are able to represent them in their own domain specific language, if you will, which is easier to work with. And that's basically what policy as code is.
Sounds like it would be very useful for us three buckets. Now people are asking about tools, but I think we'll get to that, right?
Yes. I'll be
Absolutely.
talking about Open Policy Agent, which is that's the big tool. I'm going to be looking at that. But yes, you're going to see a lot of that in action. So you'll see that in a great deal of depth coming up pretty soon. All right. Nice to see a lot of questions coming in. That's great. So let's get started with SAST. Is there anything else that anybody else wants to ask, Nikki or Amy?
No, I think I'm excited. Let's get into the, I guess, ground level here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about SAST, right? So one of the things that I'm going to be talking about in SAST is SEMGRAP. And I think a lot of us have heard of SEMGRAP. For those of you who have not heard of SEMGRAP, SEMGRAP is this tool, it's a SaaS tool that allows you to query your code, right? So it allows you to query your code for security issues, and you're able to identify these security issues based on those queries. So you can create expressions that are like this. So for instance, you can just create an expression like so. Either it's kind of combines a little bit of a syntax as well as regex like patterns to be able to, for you to be able to express your queries. And the thing that I like about SEMGRAP, especially for the unit testing piece of the whole equation, is that you are able to write small scope tests and you're able to customize them to the hilt, right? So SEMGRAP allows you to customize it. A lot of times we've had problems, especially with a lot of legacy SaaS, where you're not able to customize anything, right? You're just given a bunch of rules and that's it. You're set. And a lot of times you have the challenge where you need to constantly either get new rules, or those rules are false positives, and there's nothing much you can do about it. What I like about the newer class of SAST, which is SEMGRAP and CodeQL, there are a couple of options in this area. CodeQL from GitHub, which is not open source, but it's still available if you're a public repo, allows you to query code. And that becomes in itself a small scope unit test, right? So that's basically what I'm trying to get at here. So here, each of this is something that you're checking for. It's checking for one thing. So for instance, this JWT example here is checking for whether you're actually validating the token signature or not, which is really nice because it's easy to express, easy to write out, and you are able to actually get a quick analysis of this very fast. So when you're running it against even a pretty large code base, it happens pretty quickly. So this is what I was talking about with SAS as unit test, because you're able to write these small scope tests that give you fast feedback and they're low effort. So that's why I like SemGrep a lot. So I do have a demo here, and I'm just going to quickly run through it. So this is on our lab environment. So I just start. So we have, so let me just quickly run some SemGrep rules and see if it works. So this would be, and yeah, so let's write a very simple rule, right? So this is against, yeah, I'm just gonna. So semgrep -l Python e. So I'm just going to look for, this is literally, this is the smallest test that you can do, right? So I'm looking for a situation where we're doing a JWT decode where we're trying to decode a token, but the developer has not verified or set the verify to false, which means that the developer is actually not verifying the signature of the token, which means that you can send any token over to my system and it'll just take it. Right? It's horrible. It's a pretty horrible security setting, but it's possible. And developers make this mistake all the time. So this is something that we're looking for in my code base. Literally this simple, and I am going to run this against my code, which is, when I do this, it immediately finds that, hey, your developer has done this, right? JWT decode, password verifies equal to false. So you can see that through this very simple combination of syntax / regex style expression, where I'm just saying that, look, I'm looking for a decode, call here with JWT is the module, and I don't care about the other arguments here. I'm just looking for verify false, and that's it. You have that finding immediately available to you. So this can run in the IDE, it can run as a commit hook, you can run this very quickly, and the developer gets like near immediate feedback to this, right? So that is that's an example of how you can, so you can even write this out for, let's say you're doing code quality with it, you can use that, you can use it for security. So one of the things that I like using this for is a combination of both code quality and security, because you can do that with this sort of a framework. And you can write out more complicated rules. So I'll just give you an example of some complicated rules that we have. So here, let's look at some rules. Just two rules, again, just in the spirit of the whole unit testing piece. We're just looking for two rules here. And each rule is very purpose-built. It only does one thing, right? So let's look at the first rule, which is like this. So in SemGrep, you can write it out as YAML. So if you have a rule that is more than a single line, you can write it out as a set of patterns, which is like this. So you can say, okay, look for any type of app.route wherever. So this is a Python Flask application where it's looking for any kind of route, get, post, put, what have you. And it's checking whether there is no login required for this route, right? Which means that it's going to find all the routes that don't have login required, which means that obviously it's an unauthenticated route, which is potentially a security flaw, right? Somebody could just access it by without authenticating to it, and they can access whatever is part of that function. So that is what this single pattern is finding here. It's just looking for the anywhere, any function which login is missing. So it's looking for that. That's the one check that we're doing here. The other check that we're doing here is looking for YAML.load. So in Python, especially in a certain version of the YAML library, is vulnerable to an insecurity serialization flaw. So if you do YAML.load and you throw a YAML file or an object at it that has some kind of Python. So let's say an attacker is embedded some malicious Python code that gets it to run or is attempting to run some kind of OS command under the hood, this is going to, it would run. So the PyYAML library is so vulnerable that the YAML.load would just run that and it would just execute it. Just deserialization at its finest. So this is looking for a very similar kind of an approach, just looking for a variable here and checking whether this variable is used in a YAML function, and that's really it, right? So you'll see that you can add on to this. So tomorrow, if you want to add on to this, and they have a library of rules that you can use, whatever it is. But the idea here is that you are able to break this down into the smallest possible check. Each check is doing one thing, and that one check is going to get you the results for whatever you want or whatever you are looking to get results for. It's not exceedingly complicated, because the idea here is that you can compose your own thing, and you should be able to get quick value out of this. So let's quickly look at this exam.
I'll just jump in. There's good open source community around rule writing for SemGrep. So there's a lot of people that post rules that they've written themselves for various frameworks, languages, etc. So there's a good kind of community that you can leverage there.
Absolutely, yes. You have rule sets for Go, you have rule sets for Python, Java. You can just look at SemGrep's existing rule database. It's pretty solid set of rules that they have. So
I have a question. So I am completely new to writing security unit tests. I always talk about this like I'm a newbie. But are we going to go over some abuse cases and what those look like? Because I do see like, oh, okay, cool, perfect. Just want to make sure.
Yeah, I will try, although abuse cases are going to take me down a slightly different rabbit hole, but nevertheless, I will talk about it. It is a very important a piece of a lot of the research I am doing in the threat modeling space. But yeah, so I will try and get to it. But yeah, it's an ocean by itself. It's a different world. But I'll try and kind of map the two things as much as I can today. Yeah, so in this case, you see that we ran it against our code base, and all three rules were triggered, because you see that two of these routes didn't have login required, and one had a YAML.load, where just randomly loading this user-defined value from the front end, which is obviously not great. So we were able to find these three things based on a very small scope. And the thing with SemGrep or even CodeQL is that it's really fast. Finding security issues is really fast, and they kind of, the framework themselves lends itself to single-purpose tests, which I like. Right? SAS should not be. In fact, a couple of years ago, Justin Collins, who is the creator of Brakeman, I saw his talk at AppSecCali, and his point was that, look, don't try and load your SAS test to do too many things. One SAS test should only do one thing. And I think that holds good for unit testing as well, right? One test should do one thing and nothing more. And by doing too many things, that test becomes kind of diluted, and you tend to have false positives and all of that stuff. So that's the game plan that I was going with here. Right. Yeah, so this is just an example of this, and we have a couple of examples of Kubernetes. In fact, we have a Kubernetes example as well. Let me just pull up that Kubernetes example. So we have, so in this case, you'll see that it's not source code, it's just infrastructure as code. We're looking for, hey, make sure that my deployment has an AppArmor policy, right? That's something we're looking for. Privilege escalation set to true. All the bad stuff that could happen in Kubernetes, right? So looking for a privileged container in this case. So all these things that can be very bad. So I'm just gonna quickly, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think like the IAC world of unit testing, well, config checking, what you're describing with OPA and, other ways to check cloud configs or IAC configs, it's kind of similar as the way SemGrep works, right? You have like a config or code, and that's just sort of being grepped, right, across.
Yeah.
So I just sometimes feel like the deployment model, if you're coming from existing, unit testing suites or SAS suites, the mechanics of how this stuff works is like slightly different than it used to be, like 5-10 years ago. So I just want to highlight that, because you're kind of grepping stuff now instead of doing all sorts of other SAS techniques.
No, it's so SemGrep is still abstract syntax tree combined with that syntax that they have created or they have evolved. It's still abstract syntax tree, so you can still pull off that whole stuff that all your commercial SAS tools do, but it doesn't require you to write language specific abstract syntax tree. That's the big thing, right? The problem with most tools is that they require you to write language specific syntax tree parse rules, right? And SemGrep kind of cuts through that. And same with CodeQL. I don't see these two objectives being different from each other. The point here is you don't have to learn. So let's say you're writing, Let's say you're an organization that has Python, you have JavaScript, you have Go, you have Rust, you have .NET, you have whatnot. The idea here is that you don't have to sit and customize .NET AST rules or Python AST rules across the board. And obviously, that's not going to work because you can't scale. Whereas you can use this one framework that can help you do that. And that's I think one of the big value adds that they bring versus what a lot of other tools bring to the table. So, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, so this is just an example of the Kubernetes cluster thing that I was talking about. This here, we were not testing source code in this case. We were testing YAML, and this YAML manifest had a bunch of security issues. It had privilege, it had allow privilege escalation, it had things that are not necessarily great. So we were able to identify. It didn't have an app armor policy, but we set it up to have. We set up 3 rules, and we checked whether it was actually there's a small spelling error here, but that should, yeah. So when you actually run this against the list of that particular manifest, you'll see that it is able to find those 3 findings. So that is basically what we were looking at here. So this is the whole SAST piece of the unit testing that I was talking about. Now let's move on to the functionality-driven unit test. Now this is the whole time to threat modeling that I was talking about. And let me try and pull up an example here. So for me, functionality-driven security unit tests, I think, can give you a lot of value in these 3 places, right? One is definitely input validation, because a lot of the security flaws that we see and continue to see are because input validation is done badly or input validation is not done at all, right? So we want to identify that. And authentication, authorization, all these, so access control, authentication, input validation, things that are not super easy to test purely with your fuzzing or scanning tools, right? So these are things that you would slip through the cracks with your fuzzing or scanning tools, or even your SAS tools, right? So this is where you want to be able to break things down into a very simple unit test. And this is more the traditional unit test that we are talking about, right? So for instance, let me give you an example. So let's say I have a sign up feature, and that sign up feature requires me to submit an email and a password. Now, naturally, I would have to, so if you look at the whole abuse case, and let's talk a little bit about the whole abuse case construct here, what can go wrong with a sign up feature? So let's look at the what are the areas of concern with a sign up feature? What are the abuses that can happen against a sign up feature? So again, this is feel free to chime in, both of you as well, and some of the others. What is the abuses that can happen against the sign up feature? Somebody might sign up with a bad password that might lead to their account getting taken over later. Some of them might sign up too many accounts, or someone may not sign up with the right values. You have all of these different things, of course. And if you have anything else to add, I'll be happy to hear it as well. But these are just some things I could think of at the top of my head, right? So the idea here is to take these abuse cases and make them unit tests, right? And that's essentially, in fact, the threat modeling framework that I have been building. In fact, it's on GitHub. You can check it out if you want. It's called Threat Playbook. That's basically what it tries to get to, right? So it starts with the user story, and then which is the feature, and then the abuser story, which are the set of what can happen against it, and then how it can happen. So whether it's SQL injection or cross-site scripting, or what bug can actually be used to take over that. So that's basically our the threat scenario and abuse case, and that's the construct that we have. So here, the idea here is to use that threat model. So let's say you have this feature and you identify these abuser stories. So use that as your acceptance test, saying that, look, when in the sign up feature, we want somebody to submit a minimum 8-character password. It needs to be an email. So you have all these rules and you break them down, right? So for instance, here, by the way, if there are any questions, please feel free to interrupt me. I'm just kind of talking and talking. So here we have a very simple sign up feature, right? This is as simple as it gets. So here we have this sign up feature, and you'll see that we are accepting a user with an email and a password, which is just string. So we have some validation. The developer has done some validation here where they've said that, hey, you know what, the email should be of type string, and the password should have a minimum of 8. Minimum length. Of course, we could do much better check. We could do, your password policy could be incorporated in here. You could do all of this stuff. This is called JSON schema, by the way, for those who are interested in understanding how the validation actually happens. So this JSON schema, basically what we're doing here is we are checking first where whatever user object is coming from the side here. We're checking against this, and then if it's validated, if it's successfully validated, that's when we are we throw a successful HTTP response. But if it's not, if the validation fails, we throw a 400 response. And you can see that I've written 2 unit tests for this. Again, these 2 unit tests are very minimal unit tests. You can think of probably 2-3 other abuse cases as well, but you'll see that in the first unit test, it's not going to pass, which is the user at acme.com, pass 1 to 3, right? So this is basically this is not going to work because it's a 7-character password, and we want a minimum 8 characters. So this is going to fail. And the second one, so this is going to pass because it fails. I'm checking whether it's a 400 response code, which is fine, which is what is expected. And this is what is expected from this, which is a 200 success response code, which is pass 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, pass 1, 2, 3, 4 is not a great password, but in this case, the check is pretty minimal. If we want to do additional things, we can probably add more password rules to the validation code and have that check against it. So this is literally, it breaks this down into a very simple kind of check. This runs in a few milliseconds and it's done, right? So this kind of a check makes things a lot easier. And if this is incorporated as part of your program, that would be much more viable as well.
So where would like fuzzing harnesses come in here if this was part of your test suite along the way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the fuzzing piece you could bring in with something like Zap, or at least from a security perspective, right? You could bring in something like an OWASP Zap and use its fuzzer with the API. So OWASP Zap has a pretty strong API, and using that with something like this could it would not. I would not put it in the definition of a unit test because that would still require a little bit more. I think it will be a little bit more involved because the API needs to be running. It needs to be a runtime application. It needs to have been deployed somewhere, and then you run it. That is one possibility. You can, of course, take if you want to make something a little bit more custom driven. You can actually take some lists from elsewhere and try out all those lists. So you can take something like your sec lists from Daniel Meisler or something like that, and so you have these sec lists on GitHub that you can just take and say, hey, try out SQL injection codes against this, or try with this kind of password combos, whatever it is, right? You can load that up in here and you can do it. So that's also a possibility, but I would still put that in a little bit more of the DAST category. This is more extreme small scope stuff, right? We are looking for somebody signing up with the wrong password, or somebody signing up with a poor password. So we are taking that feature and we are breaking that down into what can happen, and that what can happen is being translated into test cases. Now, some of that cannot be translated into test cases like this. So, for instance, if I want to test that form for cross-site scripting or SQL injection, this will not make too much sense
Right.
because that would probably have your dast or something come into the picture. But this is
Right.
more like simple stuff where you can test for, hey, is this user valid? So you can probably take a user role and say that, is this user, this object, this particular action, is that valid? Come back with a test for that, which is not something you can do with dash tools or even SAS tools, right? You can do that with here with a unit test like this, which makes a lot more quick to run.
Yeah.
So if you can top load a little bit of this in your process, it makes a lot more sense.
And in your experience, you described in the beginning, like the whole cultural aspect of building out programs like this. Who owns these tests? Is this the developers, the security team? Who owns the author, like the authoring of these tests, and then the execution of these tests?
That's a very good question. I think ultimately, I'm going to kind of zoom out and zoom in here a little bit. For me, a security program is only successful if the engineering team owns security, and security is a subset of quality. So it really depends on who owns quality, right? So if your engineering team owns quality, which I think they do, because that's basically the point, right? If the engineering team owns quality, they own security, in my opinion. Again, not all teams are set up like that. Some teams are, some teams are not. But in any case, I would put this in the responsibility list of the developer itself. Now, again, it doesn't. This may not be something that the developer might do initially. You might get to this point after a while, because these kind of tests do require a little bit of coaching and involvement. It does require some collaboration as well, because you have to incorporate the results of a threat model into this, right? So you do the threat model at the beginning of the sprint. You should be in a position to incorporate that into this and make that templatizable as a set of tests that developers can unit test against. So you should say that, look, these are unit tests we want you to write, because this should be able to catch some of these things very early. But this stuff we can check with SAS. This stuff we can check further downstream. So that is a process that does take a little bit of maturity to get to. So it's not a starter practice, is what I think.
Yeah, and there's a question in chat that I think you'll probably hit on later, but I'll just give it to you now around, when you execute all these tests, right? Different layers of unit tests all along the way. There's obviously a metric some composite metric that you want to present to a leadership group or someone in the organization to let them know the current state of things. Maybe we'll get to that as you continue, but I just want to kind of put that out there. How do you report out on all of this great unit testing that people are writing inside an organization?
That's a good question again. So this comes back to my point on threat modeling. Right now, a lot of us, again, this may be something that I might get some brickbats for this message that I'm going to put out here, but I'm going to put it out there nevertheless. So a lot of us, when we think about code quality, right, or code quality, or if we think about functionality, we look at. So, for instance, if we are looking at code quality, we look at kilo lines of code, right? That's our metric, right? So, if we have 10,000 lines of code, that's basically what we are measuring against in terms of our code quality, which means that our code quality rules are based on that 10,000 lines of code. And if you're looking at functional testing, the metric is against the number of features. The number of features, the types of features, what have you, right? Again, performance, you're looking at performance metrics. You're looking at, does this come back in, do we have responses in this kind of time? What is the response? What is the maximum threshold, et cetera, et cetera. For security, unfortunately, we have a very skewed approach to defining what we are measuring it against. Now, this is a question that I have for a lot of the people in the audience as well. What is the metric of measurement for any security test? Anyone? Any thoughts around that? And of
I
course,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, I'll start coverage, right? Like, I mean, if you have all your tests running, but it only covers like 3% of your application, it's probably not that
Mhm.
great of a metric. So maybe you start with coverage. Like, how much code coverage do you have from a unit testing perspective?
Yes, but isn't code coverage again? So code coverage is code coverage from code quality, right? How does it determine security? That was the one thing that I kind of failed to understand initially as well.
So actually in the
So
audience, we're getting the diminution of risk. And I think for myself, maybe because I look at things in a more aerial way, because I'm not as deep as all y'all are, I think of just like the business value, right? And I think that that was the context of the last question about metrics. Like basically, how do you propose this to leadership so we can get more buy-in for our program to mature it?
So yeah, no, absolutely. And the way I see it is that for me, the threat model is what you measure it against, right? If again, it depends on how well the threat model is done. If the threat model is done badly, that's a different thing. But for me, is a good coverage for a security test is against a threat model, because you're saying that a threat model incorporates the concepts of risk, right? At least that it should. So when you have a threat model and you say this application, we have these threats and these threats are being tested this way, that is coverage for me. Again, I'm sure we might have differing opinions. Some of us might have differing opinions on this, but for me, that's like a much better metric, because I've seen that every other metric, especially we take from other things like functionality or code, things like that, which I don't necessarily feel serve security very well. So for me, if I would go to management, I would say that look, these are the risks that we've collaboratively identified. These are the threats, and we have tested against these threats in this way. And we have been able to identify that based on these threats, we have only identified low severity threats or low priority threats, and high priority threats have been dealt with in this release. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's
No,
my take on it.
yeah. So instead of looking at coverage, you're looking at, hey, what does our threat model tell us to look for? Are we looking at that?
Yeah.
That's our North Star here in how we want to look at this application. Yeah, no, it
Yes.
makes a lot of sense.
Also, shameless kind of opportunity for a plug on your own suite of tools. But would you say that looking at things like Orchestron and then the threat playbook, do they go back to that North Star, like you say? Like threat modeling is that North Star? Is that your North Star for all the rest of your products?
Yes, Threat Playbook
Cool.
is the Threat Playbook. Yeah, Threat Playbook is open source, so absolutely, please do check it out. I don't want to. It's open source and it's going to be open source. I'm working on a new version of it right now, but yes, that's what it's meant to be. So, in fact, the idea of Threat Playbook is that look, you should use threat modeling. So, you should be able to break it down, write your test cases, and you should be able to say, "Yeah, I was able to complete based on the checklist of threat test cases that we have. We've been able to do all of these test cases when you're good, right? Or we are not good, or whatever it is." So you should be able to make substantive product security decisions based on the threat model, and that was my objective for it. The couple of versions, we still had some issues that we're dealing with, but this version, I think, a lot of those goals will be a little bit more better aligned. So yeah, that's just basically that's my take on the whole situation.
Cool. There are a few other, I guess, metrics that people were looking at: scope, heuristic evaluation, attack surface being used, compliance to standards. I'm just saying, like the chat is lit. I've said this before, but people are very engaged.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. My point here is just to spark a conversation. So, I think, yeah, the way we do metrics and measurement is a little skewed for in a lot of places. Again, not every place, obviously. Some places really have their security dialed in, but it's not always that you see that. In my opinion, the threat model or whatever is your risk parameters for that application. Now, threat model is a very tactical term, and if you want to be a little bit more strategic about it, you might hook it back to OKRs or your risk parameters for that application and so on, to get a more strategic view of things, so that you can convey to management that look, based on our risk parameters for this division or this application, or based on the OKRs for this particular team or this particular engineering process, we've been able to reduce this much risk based on our practices. So that's again, that's a different conversation. I think that's going to be a pretty huge topic unto itself, but that's where I'm coming from.
So I don't want to derail the discussion further, but I will put out there that there is another question about demarking the line for vulnerability severity. So are you looking at this based on commercial vulnerability tool standards or making leadership state priorities? Although I feel like that's a little bit off. Just think about it if it's going to be answered somewhere in the rest of the talk.
I'm not planning to focus on that in the rest of the talk because, yeah, that's a very involved area. I think that gets into the whole vulnerability management and correlation and discussion around thresholds and severity. Yeah, I mean that's something you can do based on either standard stuff like CVSS, or if you have something else, or if you have an internal thing, that's fine too. I typically, if you don't have anything, I would go with CVSS simply because it's understood by most security people. But if you want to go to management with it, then I would think keeping it simple would be a good thing to do instead of trying to delve into the details of the score and why the score has been calculated this way and so on. So I would be a little bit more qualitative with management than quantitative. So that's my take. But again, it depends. It depends on a lot of variables here. So yeah.
Cool.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
That's interesting stuff. So
Yeah,
looks like
great discussion.
yeah. So for me, drivers for functional stuff would be something like this from your threat model. Or if you don't want to do the hard task of doing threat models really well, then you can go with something that is already kind of done for you, which is your OWASP ASVS, right? OWASP ASVS, which is the application security verification standard, is precisely for a lot of these kind of things because it gives you a very specific set of checks, and you can incorporate a lot of these checks into unit tests. And when you do that, you can build a veritable library of user stories and unit tests based on the ASVS, and that uh, perhaps make it reusable as well so that you can use it across the board. So these are just some ideas. Doesn't have to be exactly that way, but I think ASVS is a good place to start. It's actionable. It's quite practical for the most part. Some of it is a little strategic, but a lot of it is pretty tactical. So I would go with something like that. All right. Yeah, so the next one is the environmental security unit test. Now, this is more stuff around the policy Escort stuff that I was talking about. And one of the tools that I really love for this is OPA. So let me just give me a sec while I spin up the OPA lab here. Just give me a second. I should have done that before, but I'm just going to, yeah, that's fine. All right. So so environmental security test. The idea here is that today a lot of so one of the things that I explored, in fact, in a recent talk at OWASP in the Developer Summit, is that don't hard code your security implementation as part of your APIs and microservices, right? Now, let's say you have an access control. Let's say you run an API and you're an API and microservices shop. A lot of us are today, right? We run a lot of APIs, we run a lot of microservices. We have all of this deployed on containers, cloud native stuff. We might be deploying it on AWS or in cloud environment, or it might be running on Kubernetes cluster. You have all of these things. That has become a pretty common thing. And the other thing that has also happened is the API gateways, right? A lot of us are using API gateways to be able to smart route things to different APIs and different services so that things are kept running and smooth. Now, the idea behind using something like policy as code is that you embed all of that good stuff And most of the time, what used to happen was that you had to hard code all these security and access control rules in your code. But the idea today is that don't do that in your code at all. Your code should have no knowledge of security rules. Just focus on having all of your security rules and policies work with your API gateway. And if it works well with your API gateway, then all of these potential attacks and potential vulnerabilities automatically just stop at that API gateway. They don't even hit your API or the target that is actually being, uh, that's actually being queried. So the idea here is that if you are able to not embed or not hard code some of these security rules or security policies inside your code, and remember, our APIs and microservices change a lot, and we have a lot of churn in terms of the change, and that's basically why we have DevOps in the first place, because you're probably deploying multiple times, you're changing code all the time, you're adding new features all the time. So in that case, instead of hard coding the security rules and eventually uh, having inconsistencies in your process, is it possible that you look at a set of controls that work at a more centralized API gateway level that can actually handle a lot of this stuff for you? So that's basically what we're looking at. So OPA is one such framework that can do that. And OPA, I really think that OPA is the bee's knees. It's great simply because it's really powerful. It can do policy management for anything, right? You can literally extend it to any possible use case, because I've seen this used in Kubernetes. I've seen this used for OS level policy management. I've seen this used for Kafka. I've seen this used in the cloud. I've seen this used for APIs. It's really powerful. So the way it works is that everything comes in as a request, and that request is JSON, right? So JSON hierarchical data makes a lot of sense. So everything is a request. That request comes in as JSON, and OPA has this language syntax that allows you to query JSON against, right? So you can query it against the policy and say that, look, if this is allowed. So the policy is captured in a language called Rego, and you can write out your policy in multiple ways. And if you are able to, if the policy maps against what the request parameters are there, then yes, you're good to go. But if the policy is in violation, or if the request is in violation of the policy you've set up, then the request is a deny, right? So basically what OPA does is just give you a request, comes back with a response, and that's it. It's done. It comes back with a yes or no response and nothing more. So that's basically what OPA does.
Silly question.
So,
I've never
yeah.
seen what you had parenthetically around a rego. Sorry, policy rego.
Mhm.
What is that? What is rego?
Yeah, so Rego is this language that OPA has. So OPA, let's look at their playground. They have this. In fact, you can share that with folks if you want. It's called the Rego playground. So Rego is this language that OPA has created where it evaluates expressions, right? So it evaluates inputs. So in this case, if you see, we have an expression called hello, and it takes in an input message value, right, or a message key, and it checks whether that message key is world. And if the message key is world, only then it is a true or a false. So it comes back with a, I don't know what happened here. I think that's weird. Strange that happened. It seemed to be fine to me. True. Okay. Yeah. So in this case, it comes back with the true, right? So everything is evaluated as a Boolean, right? So in OPA, everything is evaluated as a true or false. It doesn't have anything else. You don't really have the ability to write you're not writing imperative code, right? That's the big difference with OPA and something else. In other things in Python, you're checking if this, if not, a switch, or whatever it is you're using in Python or Go, or whatever it is you're using, switch case, you're using a combination of if-else statements to do this. OPA, every expression breaks down into Boolean, and that can be used for a lot of different things. So for instance, if I am checking things like this, so if the user, so let's say this m is equal to Abhay, and if I evaluate this, and it comes back with a true, right? So if the input.user is Abhay, then it's true. If the input.user is, let's say, devslop, it should come back with a false, right? So it's a very simple expression that you have, but you can literally extend that to whatever it is that you want. So for instance, if you can say something like starts with M A, right? So if it starts with this, it's true. But you can say starts with D, then it's going to be false. So this is just some string-based stuff, but you can use OPA for a lot more complicated use cases. You can use it to verify signatures. You can use it to do regex matches. You can use it to do input validation. You can use it to do anything. The syntax is really powerful that can be used for anything. So you can use it in any environment and you just evaluate. So it works like a proxy. You can just send the request over to OPA first, and it'll load all the Rego policies that you've loaded as part of that. So it'll check against all the Rego policies that you have, and it'll come back with whether it's an accept or a deny, right? So in this case, you can see that this is a slightly more complicated Rego expression where it's checking whether it's actually, in fact, if you see, it's actually verifying the JWT for you based on the HTTP headers that come in, and it'll check whether it is one of these two people, Alice or Bob, right? So it looks for whether the JWT is either of Alice or Bob, and if it's one of these people, it allows you inside, or it does not allow you. It gives you an allow or a deny, right? So you can actually extend this to pretty much anything you want. I have extended this to API use cases. I've extended this to Kubernetes use cases. A lot of different use cases. It's super powerful stuff.
Yeah, I'm loving this tool because it's a sandbox where I can break things. Well, I have a question though,
Yeah,
follow
sure.
up. Is there any, I guess, like preset rules or I guess for some of those use cases that you talked about, like for Kubernetes and APIs?
Kubernetes does have a lot of preset rules. In fact, you have something called the OPA gatekeeper. Yeah, so this is the one that you want. It does have a bunch of Kubernetes rules as well. This is good. This is a good project because it has a lot of the examples. It has the constraints, and you can check this out. You can learn from this as well because it's kind of nice. I think they even have a demo app. Yeah, they have. Yeah, so they have something called Agile Bank, which seems to be a vulnerable whatever, and you can look at the resources and look at limits too high or whether the container is coming from a particular container registry or not, and that kind of stuff. So OPA Gatekeeper is a good place to start for Kubernetes. Unfortunately, for the API stuff, it's still not as mature because I think Kubernetes is more limited use case, right? There's only that much you can do wrong with the Kubernetes manifest. It's quite a bit, but it's still only that much. Whereas with APIs, it's really quite broad. So I don't know of any ready to consume rules for API or most of the other use cases. But yeah, Kubernetes, yeah, you can go nuts on some of the stuff that you have with Gatekeeper and so on.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think OPA tends to narrow, like for Kubernetes, it's a little bit narrow. The YAML is a little bit more narrow. I
Yeah.
think in Kafka, it's the same kind of thing. Like in more narrow kind of expected input, it's a little bit easier to get that, OPA integrated
Yeah.
correctly. So yeah, but it is a great tool. I mean, we use it in our own Kubernetes CTF, and I've used it for years. I mean, it really is like your, I don't know, a really frictionless way of identifying bad configs.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No.
And you could
It's
integrate
pretty,
it in any CI/CD tool. It's not
yeah.
hard to trigger. Yeah, it's really, yeah, it's a great tool.
Oh
I
yeah.
think
No, I'm
somebody,
a big fan.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, Nancy, I think posted in the YouTube channel that, looking to see who wants to show on OPA on DevSlop. So yeah, hopefully we'll do that soon.
Sure. Yeah, so the idea here with OPA is to kind of use OPA for API validation or API policy, right? So in this case, if you see that OPA becomes like your single source of truth for all of this kind of stuff, you can check whether it's the user path, whether it's this or that, whether it's validated. So the idea here is to top load a lot of the security controls to the API gateway and not have too much subjectivity or not even have the actual APIs itself have any context of what security is, right? Most of the security rules are terminated at the API gateway itself, and the API gateway links up to OPA or an identity provider with OPA and things like that to be able to integrate and stop bad things happening right there. So this is something that can be made into a lot of the unit testing that I'm talking about, and I have a demo here. Um, so OPA, the thing with OPA is, so aside from writing policies in OPA, you also have their unit testing framework, which is really nice, right? You also, it comes with the unit testing framework that you can just use off the bat. So I'm just going to run a couple of demos here for everyone. So this is I just have a basics demo and an API examples demo. And I'll just run the basics. So this is a set of policies that we have, right? So the first three ones are super basic, but the next ones kind of get a little bit more complicated. So here you'll see that we have input. We're just checking for input message. We're checking whether it's Word. We are checking whether the input user contains Bhargav. We are checking whether the input username, when you split it, does the first part of the array have start with A and second part of it starts with B, right? And then we're doing a slightly more complicated use case where we're getting the token, which is a JOT, a JWT token from the input, and we are checking whether it decodes correctly with the password, in this case password, but and then we're checking whether it has a claim value inside the token in the payload called hello, which is set to the value word. Okay, so these are the policies that we have. So just imagine we've loaded this in an API gateway somewhere, and it's being enforced as we speak. Now, the cool thing with OPA is you can write unit tests for literally all of this stuff, right? So you can, these are the unit tests for this, right? So you're checking, so you don't even before you deploy this on an API gateway and then having to deal with it, man, you can just write unit tests to make sure that it's actually working as intended. And you can write unit tests for OPA like so. So you're just literally checking based on these things. And of course, the last one with the JWT, just to give you an idea of how that has been set up, you will see that's a JOT which has a claim called message, I think. Um, yeah, and the claim is called hello, and the value of that claim is called word. So that's basically how I've set it up. So this is really simple to run. So when you run this, it's just gonna run this in. Yeah, so this is the unit test. As running the unit test, you can see it's really quick. That's it, right? That's the unit test. So if it fails the unit test, it'll tell you why it failed, and it'll give you the stack trace of what failed. But if it passes, it just gives you pass, 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 pass. And this is something that you can easily load as part of your CI/CD, right? So this would be great for a pre-deployment sort of a automation scenario where you can just check your OPA policy for security issues for against the unit tests, and if those unit tests pass, you can just go ahead and deploy it as part of your API gateway deployment wherever, right? So that's really easy to do.
One moment. Is it possible
Yeah.
at all to increase the size of some of these? Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I if I'd gotten that message a little earlier, I would have done that before. But that's fine. I hope it's not been too bad.
No, it
Right.
was me because I thought, oh, I have a small screen, but I was also looking around. Thanks.
No worries. Yeah. So here, this is a slightly more API centric policy, where we're checking that the input path is /users and it's a HTTP method post, and then we're checking the claims.user. So we're checking whether the header token validates, the JOT token validates, and it has a claim value, a claim key called the user. It could be any user type, but it should have a claim called user. That's basically what we're validating against. Now here we are validating against this profile ID. So the user accesses. So let's say www.example.com/Alice /user/Alice, right? So that's the path that we're trying to do here. And then we're checking whether it's a post request, whether the profile ID is actually the user ID, and then we're checking whether the claims.user is the same as the profile ID. In this case, I've hard coded it, but yeah, this could be just the input dot user ID. Yeah. So that's basically what you would have to do here. Sorry, let me just pull up the test cases for this. So yeah, you can see here that the user ID is Alice, the token we have, and the token also is scoped to Alice as the user. And here it's pretty basic. It's just the user method and whether the token validates or not. Right. So if you look at the token in both these cases, you will see that they have a user called, they have a claim user value called AppSecEngineer. And in the other one, they have a claim value of Alice's name, I think. We have user Alice in this case. Just going to increase my screen size. Hopefully it's visible to everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I'm just going to run this as another quick demo, and you'll see. Oops. Let's go close all these screens out. And all of them pass. So we have two tests, all of them pass. So this is a very literal unit test, right? So we're just taking OPA, we're writing policy as code, and we're essentially ensuring that that policy as code has unit tests to support it, and that unit test becomes another in our series of unit tests, which makes it a lot easier for us to validate a lot of these security rules right at the gateway, and you don't have to do anything else with it. Right, so that is how OPA can be used. This is I have much more complicated demos, but I just thought I'll show you this one for now because it just gives you an idea of how you can use that to unit test. Any questions on this? Any questions? I'll be happy to take them.
Not on this, but there is something in the chat. I feel like, I don't know what it is, but questions about machine learning, whenever I'm on the show, they happen to come up. But so do you have a framework maybe that uses machine learning models that could be used for security tests? I'm not sure that I understood the exact question, but if
Yeah, a
you
lot
could
of
kind of
people.
provide
Yeah,
me
a
with
lot of people come. Yeah, a lot of people have that question. To be honest, I have not seen too many of those. I've seen them in a certain side of the security fence, not in more AppSec related stuff. At least I have not. I'm sure my knowledge is not it doesn't extend to everything in the industry, but I've not seen them in the AppSec space too much. I have seen machine learning being used with Kubernetes incident management. So one of the use cases that I came across was, in fact, in a talk last year's KubeCon talk, where I'm not sure of the name of the company. So this company was using a Kubernetes security incident management, not security incident management. They were using this incident detection tool within Kubernetes called Falco, which is a very popular container security tool. And they, over time, they had all the alerts of Falco. They passed it through some machine learning, and they were able to fine tune their alerts and their alert, whether that alert was actually real or not, right? Based on some of the stuff that they saw. So that was something that was there. I have seen some of that being used, but not with this stuff. No, I personally have not come across it. Maybe there's something there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all
I
that's
think
like
the
new stuff, new territory.
yeah, and I guess like in this world, it would probably be better to take the secure by default approach, maybe like kind of stop the things that you don't want to happen, like with better configs, than maybe relying on an ML model to detect that. But I don't know. I'm sort of just
I think an ML
brainstorming
model
here.
inherently requires crap ton of data, and I think most of us
Yeah,
don't. Uh, most of us don't have it in a way that is easily modeled and expressible. And as a result, you would find that it's a little hard to push that through. And I mean, at least I would find it hard. Maybe there are companies that have enough data that they can use that. But at least from an AppSec perspective, I find that ML tends to be a little bit of a mirage because of this, because of the data insufficiency. That's my take, but yeah, I agree with you. I prefer just going with a more tried and tested approach of getting things to actually be secure by default or as secure by default as possible, rather than depending on ML, because that tends then you're getting into ML biases, AI biases, and all of that territory, which is another rabbit hole by itself.
Or you overly rely on the model, and
Yeah,
then yeah,
yeah.
maybe in 10 years we'll have you back and we'll revisit this one.
I still don't think I'll be much of an AI or ML proponent by then in 10 years. I did a little bit of dabbling with ML and AI, but not nearly enough to call myself even something close to an expert in that space. Anyway, yeah, so this is the policy as code thing that I was talking about. OPA, like I said, it's quite extensible. You can use it for a lot of different things. I've used it with a lot of API gateways, Kubernetes, and stuff like that. The runtime security unit test is a pretty interesting approach. This is something that I think only one dash scanner actually managed to really take this and do something with it, which is OWASP Zap. So this essentially, the idea here is that you're not running a full dash. What you're doing is you're running a very minor, very basic 1 minute, dash type of an approach where you're just checking for very, very basic things, right? Like things like HTTP header stuff and things like that. Header stuff, CSP, CORS, those sort of tests. Of course, you don't have to do this with Zap. You can do this with unit tests also. That's perfectly fine. But the idea here is that you can use Zap, run it for a minute, and it should be able to uncover a lot of this for you. This is called a Zap baseline test for those of you who are interested. Zap has this. It runs for exactly 60 seconds and it terminates. It basically just runs a bunch of HTTP header stuff. Now that's useful. Again, don't think of it as, oh my God, what's the point of running this when there is no dash? The point of this is that you're still getting some level of security assurance in every single in every single deployment or every single CI/CD run. So that's still there. There is some value with it. It's not, again, it depends upon how you have set up your test, but I have found that this is useful, especially in uncovering some low-hanging stuff. But it's not obviously perfect. It's still, DAST is not going to be able to give you speed, and unit tests are inherently about speed. So I would not necessarily take this to too much more than this, because that's all DAST can do. They can fire a bunch of payloads, but even firing those payloads, reading those rules, and then figuring out whether it's vulnerable or not, it's going to take some time. Even if you optimize that to quite a bit, it's going to take some time. So I would not put this so much in the unit test column, but I would put this more in the service and workflow test side of the fence. So, but you can still do a little bit of that with this baseline scanning capability. One of the things that we do at V45 is we do something called security regressions, and that's something I've it's kind of nascent, but I've seen some people doing it as well. So the concept of a security regression is that you have somebody who's discovered a flaw, let's say a bounty hunter or a pen tester or somebody who has identified a slightly complex business logic or multi-step style flaw. The idea here is, instead of giving your developers a PDF report, you give them a regression test that would check against this flaw. And if this regression test uncovers, it finds the same flaw, it's just basically just a rerun of that set of conditions that would trigger the flaw. It's just like any other regression, right? To check whether it is fixed or not fixed. And the idea here is that if it's fixed, then you have a winner. Then if you don't, obviously you have to go back ahead and fix it. So we found this to be a lot more effective with our clientele, because instead of giving them PDF reports, I mean, it's not that we don't give them reports, but the reports tend to make very little sense. But these make a lot more sense for a lot of developers, because developers like to get immediate feedback, and regressions can help with that immediate feedback part of it. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about as well. But yeah, so this is, these are some of the examples of unit tests that we have. And yeah, these are some of the examples. These are some of the approaches that you can use with unit tests. The idea here is that if you can top load your security program with some of these unit tests or some of these approaches, then you are actually reducing a lot of the burden downstream, because you should be able to uncover a lot of flaws quickly, get quick feedback, and get moving on most of your security program right here, rather than having to do this further downstream. So that's yeah, this is security unit test. If you do have any other questions, I'll be happy to take it. But
We do have one that we missed from way earlier, and also I have a comment. I love anything that is going to keep us from having to sort through a bunch of like false positives. So I
yeah,
think unit tests really help in that way. So the question was around the like who needs to set the impact levels for each department and threat model. Sorry, we're going way back. Um,
uh-huh.
but they were asking, could it be the CISO, the CEO, the department leads, or is it a panel for a best solution?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't quite
Oh,
catch the
yeah,
first part of that question. Sorry.
yeah. So, who needs to set the impact levels for each department's threat models?
Okay. Uh, each department. Okay. That's a hard question, because again, I would say that it comes back to some sense of business risk, right? Now, most of us in threat models, we tend to focus on the technical threats, but really all those technical threats tie back into business risk. And if the business risk can be, if somebody is responsible for business risk in that department or that team or that particular um, that stream, then I would say that they are probably going to be responsible. Somebody who is the business sponsor or the project owner, or one of those business folks who can who is able to get both the perspective of business risk from security risk and vice versa. So that would be uh, my answer to that.
To a very complex question. Makes sense. Right. Well, you also have a lot of thanks here in the show. A lot of good takeaways as what the feedback is. That's from Samir. So
Thank you.
I mute, you mute, we all unmute Nikki. I get to say it.
I'm muted. I don't know. No, this was really great. I feel like, again, like, to break this complex topic down into these four different areas is a really, I don't know, I keep repeating that, but I really think it's a great sort of way to divide up how you want to conquer this really large kind of domain. So yeah, it was really great for you to walk us through that. I
Yeah.
learned a
Thank
lot.
you.
No,
Thank
thank
you.
you for the
Thanks so much.
examples.
Appreciate
Yeah,
it. Thank you.
yeah, and I think in the chat, everyone's happy. Really interesting talk for people like in DevOps. So yeah, cool. So Amy, do we have stuff coming up?
I was about to not be muted, right? Yes, we do a bunch, and I actually have to look it up. So give me a second. All right. So our next show will be on October 3rd with James Williams from Contrast Security, and then Vicky Lee from Shift Left, yes, our sponsor, will be back with her colleague. Oh my goodness, I'm going to mess up this name. Sharka Sharma on October 15th, and of course, definitely make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next live stream.
All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Abhay. It was really great to have you here. Look forward to
Thanks
chatting
for having
again.
me. Thank
All
you.
right. Have a good week.